For years, Anthony Blunt walked through the royal world as a trusted guardian of the Queen's pictures. Britain's security service, meanwhile, knew something the public did not. He had confessed to spying for the Soviet Union. He admitted it in 1964, received immunity from prosecution, and stayed connected to the royal collection. Queen Elizabeth II was not fully informed until years later. Then, an older mystery resurfaced, a secret royal mission to Germany in 1945. Was Blunt protected because he cooperated with intelligence, or because he knew something the palace desperately feared becoming public? Those two answers lead to very different stories. Anthony Blunt did not look like the sort of man a palace would fear. He was an art historian, a scholar of Nicolas Poussin, a man admired for his intellectual control. His public reputation rested on judgment, discretion, and an eye for details other people missed. Those qualities made him valuable in galleries, archives, and royal rooms. They also made the later discovery of his other life feel almost perversely appropriate. In 1945, Blunt became surveyor of the King's pictures. The title sounds ceremonial, but the work was practical and trusted, studying, cataloging, advising on, and helping care for the paintings of the royal collection. He served George VI, then continued under Queen Elizabeth II after her accession. He was never a member of the royal family. He belonged instead to its professional inner machinery. That is worth keeping in view because Blunt was not wandering freely through every private royal room, whatever later legend suggests. His access came through an official cultural role with defined responsibilities. Yet the role carried prestige and proximity, and it rested on extraordinary confidence from the institution employing him. The public saw cultivated service. Inside Britain's security files, another identity was slowly taking shape. The contradiction was almost too perfect. In one life, Blunt examined paintings for signs of authorship and authenticity. In the other, he had spent years concealing his own allegiance. His professional world rewarded patience, classification, memory, and silence. Espionage demanded many of the same habits. The interesting question is not whether the palace hired a spy to steal its secrets, but how a former Soviet agent could remain inside a trusted royal role after the state learned the truth. Blunt's royal appointment came after the most important period of his espionage, and that order of events keeps the story honest. Records do not establish that Moscow recruited him to penetrate Buckingham Palace, nor do they show him routinely stealing secrets directly from Queen Elizabeth II. His principal espionage belonged to an earlier phase, when Britain itself had placed him inside its wartime intelligence system. The path began at Cambridge during the 1930s, with Europe sliding toward fascism, authoritarianism, and war. Among some young British intellectuals, communism looked less like an ideology than an answer to fascism. Soviet intelligence understood that atmosphere and exploited it. Blunt moved in circles where political conviction, elite education, and secrecy could coexist with surprising ease. He was recruited for Soviet intelligence before the Second World War. The group around him later became famous as the Cambridge Spy Network, and names such as Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, Kim Philby, and John Cairncross turned into shorthand for British institutional failure. At the time, though, these men looked nothing like outsiders attacking the establishment. They had been educated inside it, they spoke its language, and they carried the social signals that encouraged trust. Britain's old security culture leaned heavily on reputation, background references, and social confidence. Those were never the only tests, but they could tilt judgment, and men who knew the right people could appear safer than they were. Blunt's betrayal exposed more than one man's ideology. It showed how the habits of an elite system could become its weak points. During the war, Blunt joined MI5. This was the decisive opportunity. He now worked inside the organization responsible for protecting Britain from espionage and subversion. According to the later record of his confession, he passed information obtained through that position to his Soviet contacts. The precise human cost and operational damage are still debated by historians. The betrayal itself is not in dispute. British intelligence trusted him, and he secretly served another power. It is tempting to imagine Blunt as a cold operator who never doubted himself. The surviving record is messier. Ideology mattered, and so did friendship. Loyalty inside the Cambridge circle became tangled up with political conviction. None of that excuses him. Whatever motives Blunt believed he had, he knowingly redirected secret material entrusted to him by the British state. When the war ended, his intelligence career formally receded, and he moved toward the world most people would later know him for: art history. He became director of the Courtauld Institute and surveyor of the King's Pictures. In 1956, his royal service was recognized with a knighthood in the Royal Victorian Order. From the outside, his life looked like that of a settled, distinguished scholar, but the past had not gone anywhere. In 1951, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean fled Britain, and their disappearance triggered one of the most damaging security scandals of the Cold War. Blunt's connections to Burgess drew renewed attention, especially after he dealt with material left behind following the defection. The episode did not immediately produce a prosecutable case against him, but suspicion began circling closer. MI5 questioned Blunt repeatedly. Margaret Thatcher later told Parliament that he was interviewed 11 times over 8 years. He kept denying that he had worked for Soviet intelligence. Investigators found discrepancies and causes for concern, yet suspicion was not proof. The security service needed evidence it could actually use, and for years it did not have it. That delay later fed the belief that someone powerful must have been protecting him. The record shows a less dramatic problem first. Investigators could suspect a man without being able to prove his guilt in court. The gap between intelligence knowledge and courtroom evidence would eventually shape the entire scandal, and it would produce the deal that kept Blunt's name secret for another 15 years. The repeated interviews also complicate the popular image of effortless protection. Blunt was not simply waved away after one polite conversation. Security officers came back to him again and again, testing his explanations while lacking proof strong enough for court. That history shows failure without requiring a single hidden patron. The system saw smoke for years and could not convert suspicion into a case. When stronger information finally arrived, officials were already conditioned to think in intelligence terms rather than public justice. Before that confession, though, there was another episode, one that later became almost irresistible to conspiracy writers. It happened in Germany just after the war. The mission, the royal connection, and the secrecy surrounding it were all real. What remains uncertain is whether later storytellers loaded more onto the trip than the surviving evidence can carry. In 1945, George VI sent Royal Librarian Owen Morshead to Friedrichshof Castle near Frankfurt, and Blunt went with him. Europe was in chaos, royal collections were scattered, and private archives faced uncertain futures. The two men were sent on a sensitive retrieval mission connected to correspondence belonging to the extended royal family. Blunt knew German and already had relevant expertise, so his presence made practical sense. The documented purpose centered on thousands of letters written by Queen Victoria to her eldest daughter, Victoria, who became Empress Frederick of Germany. These were intimate family papers. Private royal correspondence can hold complaints, judgments, political opinions, and unguarded comments never meant for public inspection. Protecting material like that did not require a criminal secret. Privacy alone made recovery important. That point often disappears in retellings. A royal household recovering private family letters from post-war Germany can sound suspicious simply because the operation was discreet. But discreet is not the same as sinister. The monarchy had obvious reasons to protect correspondence belonging to Queen Victoria and her descendants, so the mission has a documented explanation that does not depend on espionage or blackmail. Still, the trip created a genuine historical opening. Friedrichshof belonged to a German branch of the wider royal family, and the Duke of Windsor, the former Edward VIII, had already become associated with controversy over his contacts with Nazi Germany. His 1937 visit to Germany and meeting with Adolf Hitler were public facts. After the war, documents concerning German approaches to the former king would become a lasting source of embarrassment. Some biographers and writers later suggested that Blunt's mission involved more than Queen Victoria's letters, and that he may also have searched for papers concerning the Duke of Windsor and Nazi Germany. The theory is seductive because it joins two enormous scandals, a royal embarrassment and a Soviet spy, and because it offers a neat answer to the later question of Blunt's survival inside the establishment. Neat answers deserve the most scrutiny. No public archival chain has established that Blunt returned from Friedrichshof holding a secret collection capable of blackmailing the royal family. The letters, the sensitive mission, and the Duke of Windsor's controversies are all documented facts. The leap from those facts to a private cache used as leverage against the palace remains unproven. The gap matters most when we reach 1964. If the palace spared Blunt because he possessed devastating Windsor material, you would expect the historical record to show some trace of that pressure. Instead, the surviving official explanation for his immunity grows out of a very different problem. MI5 had suspected him for years and still lacked admissible evidence. Then an American named Michael Straight changed the equation. Straight had known Blunt at Cambridge. In 1963, he disclosed his own earlier recruitment by Soviet intelligence to American authorities, and his information brought investigators back toward Blunt with something more substantial than suspicion. In February of the following year, MI5 officer Arthur Martin interviewed Straight, who directly implicated Blunt in Soviet recruitment activity. Now, MI5 had leverage, but it still had a legal problem. Information from intelligence sources could be compelling without being usable in open court. A prosecution might expose sources, methods, or information that could not safely be produced. Worse, after years of denials, investigators still did not possess the conventional evidence needed to guarantee conviction. The state wanted something else from Blunt: cooperation, On April 23, 1964, Arthur Martin visited Blunt at his flat above the Courtauld Institute. The encounter is unusually well documented because Martin wrote a detailed account. He confronted Blunt with the new information and watched him resist. Blunt at first continued the pattern that had protected him for years. Then Martin offered something extraordinary. If Blunt told the truth, he was assured no action would be taken against him. That promise transformed the interview. According to Martin's account, there was a long pause. Blunt asked for a few minutes while he wrestled with his conscience. Then he began to confess. This is the moment when one mystery ended. From that day forward, the British security establishment was no longer merely suspicious. Blunt acknowledged his work for Soviet intelligence. He described his recruitment, his wartime contacts, and aspects of the Cambridge network. Martin still believed he was holding material back, but the essential fact was settled. And then something extraordinary did not happen. There was no public arrest, no dramatic removal from royal service, no announcement that one of Britain's most respected art historians had betrayed the country. The state kept the confession secret. The secrecy was deliberate. The Attorney General, Sir John Hobson, had authorized an offer of immunity from prosecution in exchange for Blunt's cooperation. Thatcher later explained to Parliament that investigators had spent nearly 13 years without obtaining firm evidence suitable for prosecution, and that the new information implicating him was not usable as courtroom evidence. Officials chose intelligence value over a public trial. This was no royal pardon and no private act of mercy by Queen Elizabeth II. It was a counterintelligence decision involving the security authorities and the Attorney General, made to obtain information about Soviet operations and Blunt's associates. Whether that bargain was justified is a fair question. But the documented mechanism matters because it sharply limits what can responsibly be blamed on the monarch. The deal also explains why Blunt's confession could not simply be converted into a prosecution. A confession obtained after a promise of immunity created obvious legal barriers. The state had effectively chosen its path before Blunt fully opened up, information in secret rather than punishment in public. Once that choice was made, the government inherited the burden of preserving the agreement. There was another cost. Once immunity was promised, every later choice became entangled with the original bargain. Dismissing Blunt too quickly might expose his cooperation. Publicly stripping his honors could invite questions officials were not prepared to answer. Even telling more people inside government increased the chance of a leak. A tactical decision made during one interview went on to shape years of institutional behavior. And the secrecy did not need to begin as favoritism to end up looking exactly like favoritism from outside. This is where the accusation of class protection becomes harder to dismiss, at least emotionally, even if it cannot be proved as the sole cause. Blunt was a Cambridge-educated scholar, a knight, a director of a prestigious institute, and a trusted royal official. Many ordinary people later wondered whether someone without those connections would have received the same patience. Parliament itself erupted with anger when the arrangement became public. Yet privilege and intelligence logic can exist at the same time. The fact that Blunt belonged to the establishment does not erase the operational reasons officials gave for immunity. And operational reasons do not erase the possibility that status influenced how gently he was treated afterward. Historical judgment is difficult here precisely because both realities may have reinforced each other. The most astonishing decision went beyond sparing him prosecution. His public life remained largely intact. He continued as surveyor of the Queen's pictures until 1972, then remained connected to the royal collection in an advisory capacity until 1978. The man had confessed to Soviet espionage, yet outwardly he still carried the appearance of establishment trust. Why allow that? Thatcher's later explanation came down to secrecy. The Queen's private secretary had been consulted before Blunt confessed because his royal appointment created a special problem. Officials advised that no immediate action should be taken if he cooperated. Removing him abruptly could alert former Soviet contacts and others under investigation that he had broken. As counterintelligence, that explanation is plausible. A sudden dismissal could have sent a signal. The state was trying to learn from Blunt without revealing that it had turned him into a source, and keeping his professional exterior intact preserved the illusion that nothing had changed. But every year the illusion continued created a second problem. By then the state was doing more than concealing an investigation. It was sustaining a public reputation. At what point does operational secrecy become institutional self-protection? No single document answers that. Avoiding publicity may initially have served an active investigation. Over time, however, exposure would also have embarrassed MI5, the government, the court old, and the royal household. The longer the secret survived, the more institutions had something to lose from disclosure. The palace timeline matters enormously here. For decades, the phrase, "the palace knew," blurred several different people into one body. Newly released MI5 files make the picture more precise. Officials inside the royal household were informed in stages. That does not mean Queen Elizabeth II personally knew the full truth in 1964. Before the crucial interview, her private secretary, Michael Adine, was told that Blunt was under suspicion and that MI5 intended to confront him. The royal household, therefore, had institutional knowledge that a serious security problem existed, but the newly released files indicate that Elizabeth herself was not fully briefed on Blunt's confession at that time. Even Adine appears not to have received the full post-confession picture immediately. The picture sharpened over the following years. Records released by the National Archives indicate that senior household officials learned more as time passed. And by the early 1970s, concern had shifted toward another danger. What would happen if Blunt died and the press exposed everything afterward? A secret originally justified by intelligence needs was becoming a reputational time bomb. In 1972, according to the released records, the Queen's private secretary, Martin Charteris, told MI5 that the monarch did not know Blunt's full security history. He saw little advantage in burdening her when nothing could apparently be done about the situation. That sentence reveals something more complicated than a royal cover-up. Officials were deciding what the Queen herself needed to know, not merely shielding Blunt from her. That changed in 1973. Blunt had been unwell, and officials feared that his death could release the story into the press. The government now had to consider how damaging it would be for Elizabeth II to learn through newspapers that a former member of her household had confessed years earlier. So she was told. The surviving note records that she received the information calmly and without apparent surprise, and that she remembered Blunt had been under suspicion much earlier. That recollection proves something narrower than knowledge of the confession since 1964. It proves she remembered the earlier doubts surrounding him. Suspicion and confession are different things. The 1973 briefing also shows how secrecy can change its own purpose over time. In 1964, officials could argue that silence protected an active counterintelligence effort. Nearly a decade later, the concern included what newspapers might publish if Blunt died before the monarch had been warned. The problem had shifted from catching spies toward managing disclosure. That is no proof of a royal conspiracy. It is a picture of an operational secret slowly becoming a reputational one, without any single official announcing the transformation. This rearranges the moral weight of the story. The confirmed secrecy was real, but it never operated as a simple command from the throne. The state knew, security officials knew, and certain royal officials were informed in stages, while the Queen herself appears to have been kept from the full truth for years. So was the secrecy designed to protect her, or did it also prevent her from questioning decisions already made in her name? That question is stronger than accusing her of ordering a cover-up, and it is more uncomfortable. A constitutional monarch depends on officials to filter sensitive information, and the system exists to protect the sovereign from unnecessary operational detail. But filtering can become a form of control. If advisors decide what the monarch should not know, they also decide which questions the monarch can never ask. By then, Blunt had already left the surveyor post, yet the secret remained intact. He kept his knighthood and continued to move through the art world with considerable prestige. Nothing in the public image told ordinary citizens that the state had already confirmed his betrayal. The appearance of honor survived because the truth had been administratively contained. And that is exactly why the Friedrichshof theory returned with such force. Once people learned that Blunt had confessed and still remained protected, ordinary counterintelligence explanations felt insufficient. Why would Britain tolerate such humiliation? Why would a man linked to Soviet espionage remain so close to royal institutions? The old German mission suddenly looked less like an archival errand and more like possible leverage. The theory usually takes a simple form. Blunt went to Germany and encountered damaging material about the Duke of Windsor. He retained knowledge, copies, or some other form of control over those secrets. Years later, when his own espionage was exposed inside government, that knowledge supposedly discouraged the palace from acting against him. It is an elegant chain. The problem is that several links are missing. Blunt went to Friedrichshof. He helped recover royal correspondence, and the Duke of Windsor's relationship with Nazi Germany generated serious historical controversy. What we do not have is public evidence proving that Blunt possessed a specific cache of documents and used it to threaten the royal family. Nor do we need the theory to explain the immunity agreement. The government's counterintelligence reasoning was stated openly once the scandal broke. MI5 had failed to build an admissible case. Michael Straight's information provided leverage, but not courtroom proof. And the Attorney General approved immunity so investigators could extract cooperation. That sequence is documented. The theory, therefore, solves a problem that already has a less glamorous explanation. That does not rule out every archival possibility. It means the burden of proof sits with anyone claiming blackmail. And without a letter, a memorandum, a witness account, or a documented demand connecting Windsor material to Blunt's immunity, the claim stays speculation rather than fact. There is also a chronological problem. The decision to keep Blunt in place was tied directly to the fear of alerting Soviet contacts and other suspects, a concern that existed at the moment of confession and required no knowledge of secret royal leverage. The most plausible interpretation remains bureaucratic and operational, even if establishment embarrassment later strengthened the desire for continued silence. But bureaucratic should not be mistaken for harmless. The state made a conscious choice to hide the truth from the public. That secrecy protected an intelligence operation, and it also protected the reputation of institutions that had failed. Blunt's continuing respectability meant the public saw honors without knowing about the betrayal. The government kept the information while citizens kept a false impression. By 1979, the arrangement became impossible to sustain. Writer Andrew Boyle published a book about the Cambridge spies and referred to a mysterious figure under the name Maurice. The clues pointed strongly toward Blunt, and journalists closed in. What had survived behind official doors for 15 years was now moving into public view without government control. The pressure reached Parliament. On November 15th, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher confirmed in a written answer that Blunt had indeed been a Soviet agent. 6 days later, she gave the House of Commons a much fuller account. The man who had lived behind institutional silence was now named by the state itself. Thatcher described the years of suspicion, the new information in 1964, the absence of prosecutable evidence, and the Attorney General's decision to offer immunity. She also explained the consultation with the Queen's private secretary. Her defense was essentially that the security service had chosen the path most useful to national security at the time. Parliament was not satisfied. The anger was immediate because the scandal offended several ideas of fairness at once. A man who betrayed state secrets had not gone to prison. A knight had kept his honor. A royal official had stayed in place. And governments of different parties had lived with the arrangement. What intelligence professionals called an operational bargain looked to many citizens like one law for insiders and another for everyone else. Even former Prime Minister James Callaghan later acknowledged that Blunt appeared to have been treated too gently. By now, the controversy was about accountability as much as espionage. Who had the authority to trade prosecution for intelligence? How long could such a trade stay secret? And when did protecting national security become protecting the establishment from embarrassment? Blunt's knighthood was withdrawn after the public exposure, but the gesture could not reverse 15 years of concealment. He was never prosecuted for the espionage he had confessed. The immunity agreement remained the decisive barrier. Public disgrace replaced a criminal trial. The outcome frustrates the desire for a clean ending. We expect exposure to produce punishment proportional to betrayal, but the state had surrendered that option years earlier. By the time the public learned the truth, officials could condemn Blunt without fully undoing the deal that had protected him. The scandal ended with revelation rather than conventional justice. It also produced myths that have been difficult to separate from the record. One says the Queen knowingly protected Blunt from the moment of confession. The released files do not support that timeline. Another says the palace employed him specifically as a Soviet channel. There is no evidence for that. A third says he blackmailed the monarchy with Nazi documents recovered in Germany, and that remains an unproven theory. The confirmed story is already extraordinary enough. Blunt served Soviet intelligence. He worked inside MI5 during the wartime, then occupied a trusted royal art post. After years of suspicion, he confessed in 1964. The Attorney General had authorized immunity to obtain cooperation, and the state kept his identity secret. He then remained surveyor until 1972 and an advisor for several more years. Queen Elizabeth II was not fully informed until 1973, according to the declassified files, and the public remained unaware until 1979. Those facts need no embellishment. They also reveal a deeper conflict inside democratic government. Intelligence agencies sometimes require secrecy to protect sources, methods, and investigations. But secrecy removes decisions from public scrutiny. When officials promise immunity, citizens cannot evaluate that bargain until years later. By then, evidence may be inaccessible, participants may be dead, and the original operational need may have disappeared. Blunt benefited from exactly that gap. Officials may have believed they were choosing the lesser danger. Class instinct may have made the choice easier, and institutional embarrassment may have kept the secrecy going longer than necessary. The available record supports debate about all of those possibilities. It does not establish that Buckingham Palace engineered the arrangement. The Queen's position is especially revealing. Her household was connected to the secret, yet she appears to have been insulated from its full meaning for years. In one reading, officials protected the sovereign from a problem she could not solve. In another, they protected their own decisions from royal scrutiny. Both readings fit the timeline better than the idea that Elizabeth personally directed the cover-up from the beginning. That leaves the Duke of Windsor theory in its proper place. The Friedrichshof mission shows that Blunt really did handle sensitive royal material and really did take part in discreet work designed to protect private dynastic papers, which explains why later suspicion attached itself to him so easily. It does not prove he found a weapon he could later use against the crown. There is a broader irony in that mission. Blunt was trusted to preserve the privacy of a royal family while secretly carrying his own history of disloyalty. He could be reliable in one task and treacherous in another. Human beings rarely fit the clean categories institutions prefer, and that complexity may have made him harder to read and easier to rationalize. The same goes for the officials who handled him. They did not need to admire Blunt to see value in his cooperation, and they did not need to believe him innocent to keep him publicly respectable. Intelligence work often involves bargains with compromised people. The moral danger begins when the bargain outlives its operational necessity and becomes a habit of concealment. By 1979, the habit finally broke. Thatcher's disclosure transformed Anthony Blunt from a guarded state secret into a national symbol of establishment failure. The revelation did not confirm every rumor around him, but it did confirm something concrete. The British state had knowingly preserved the public standing of a confessed Soviet spy because officials believed secrecy served a larger purpose. Whether that purpose justified 15 years is the unresolved judgment. The government could argue that immunity produced intelligence and avoided exposing sensitive investigations. Critics could answer that the arrangement denied the public accountability and let privilege disguise betrayal. Both positions begin from the same confirmed facts, which is what makes the case stronger than any conspiracy theory. The record therefore leaves two kinds of secret. The first is proven. Anthony Blunt confessed in 1964, received immunity, and remained publicly protected from exposure. Officials inside the royal household were informed in stages, while Elizabeth II was fully briefed only later. His identity stayed concealed until 1979. The second secret is imagined but unproved. Perhaps Blunt found explosive Windsor material in Germany, knew things the royal family desperately wanted hidden, and gained private leverage from them. No public evidence has established that chain, and the documented immunity process does not require it. That is the verdict the record supports. Blunt did not stay near the royal world because nobody had discovered who he was. He stayed because people who had discovered the truth decided that secrecy, intelligence value, and institutional stability mattered more than immediate public disclosure. The most troubling mystery, then, is not whether the palace hid a magical file. It is how long respectable institutions can preserve a lie once they convince themselves the lie serves a necessary purpose. Did Britain protect national security, or did it also protect the establishment from its own scandal? Tell us where you think that line was crossed. If you value royal investigations that separate documented facts from irresistible theories, like this video and subscribe to the Palace Circle. We will keep opening the files, following the evidence, and asking what official silence really protected